The harsh Montana winter had been especially cruel that year, leaving Mason Reed with nothing but a crumbling ranch and mounting debts. When a proposition came from Elaine Whitfield, a wealthy widow 30 years his senior, with deteriorating eyesight, it seemed like divine intervention, a marriage of convenience that would save his family legacy. But just 3 days after saying, "I do," Mason uncovered a truth that would change everything. Sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected. Forms and secrets aren't always what they seem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The creaking leather of Mason Reed's worn boots announced his arrival as he trudged through the snow toward the First National Bank of Pinecrest. At 42, his face weathered by years under the Montana sun and recent hardship, Mason barely resembled the optimistic rancher who had inherited the Eagle Ridge Ranch from his father 15 years ago. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, a cheerful sound that contrasted with the grave mission that brought him there. Mason removed his Stetson, snow falling from its brim onto the polished wood floor. Theodore Blake, the bank manager and a man Mason had known since childhood, looked up from his desk with a grim expression. "Mason?" Theodore nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Mason sat, placing his hat on his knee. "I've come to discuss an extension, Ted. Just until spring. The cattle market will recover by then, and I've got deals lined up with—" Theodore held up a hand, stopping Mason mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, but the board has made their decision. Eagle Ridge Ranch is 3 months behind on payments. We've been more than accommodating, Mason, given your history and your parents' standing in the community, but business is business." Mason leaned forward, his calloused hands clasped together tightly. "That ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it with his bare hands after the Civil War." "And you've let it fall into disrepair and debt," Theodore replied, his voice softening slightly. "Look, you have until the end of the month. Either come up with the $75,000 you owe, or the bank will have no choice but to foreclose." The sum hung in the air between them, impossibly large. Mason nodded slowly, placed his hat back on his head, and stood. There was no point arguing further. As he turned to leave, Theodore called after him. "Mason, Patricia Donovan is looking for a ranch handover at Willow Creek. It's not ownership, but it's honest work." The suggestion stung worse than the biting cold outside. Mason Reed, whose family name had once meant something in Pinecrest, reduced to working on someone else's land. "I'll figure something out," Mason said, his voice hollow as he pushed through the door. The drive back to Eagle Ridge Ranch was lonely and bleak. Mason's ancient pickup truck struggled through the snow-covered roads, the heater barely working against the February chill. As he crested the hill that overlooked his property, he allowed himself a moment to take in the view. The 2-story farmhouse where he'd grown up, the barn that needed a new roof, and the sprawling pastures now blanketed in white, all of it would soon belong to someone else. Inside the house, Mason lit the wood stove and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon. The quiet was overwhelming. After his wife, Sarah, had died from cancer 5 years ago, the place had never felt the same. Their dreams of filling the house with children had died with her, and in his grief, Mason had thrown himself into work, neglecting the business side of the ranch. By the time last year's drought hit, followed by a precipitous drop in cattle prices, the financial foundation was already crumbling. Mason was startled from his thoughts by the ring of the landline phone. Few people called the house these days. "Reed." "Residence," he answered, his voice rough from disuse. "Mason? It's Meredith from the Silver Pines Assisted Living Center." Mason frowned. He occasionally did odd jobs for the facility on the edge of town, but hadn't been there in months. "I'm sorry to call out of the blue," Meredith continued, "but one of our residents specifically asked for you, Elaine Whitfield. She says she needs to discuss an important matter. Would you be able to come by tomorrow morning?" The name didn't immediately register with Mason. "Elaine Whitfield?" "Yes. She moved here about 6 months ago from Boston. She mentioned meeting you at Palmer's Christmas party." A vague memory surfaced. An elegant older woman with silver hair and a kind smile. They'd chatted briefly about horses, nothing that would explain this summons. "Tell her I'll be there at 10, Mason replied, curiosity getting the better of him. The next morning, Mason made an effort to look presentable. He shaved, put on his least worn pair of jeans, and a clean flannel shirt. Whatever this meeting was about, it would be a welcome distraction from his financial woes, if nothing else. The Silver Pines Assisted Living Center was the newest building in Pinecrest, a sprawling single-story structure with modern amenities that contrasted with the town's otherwise rustic charm. At the reception desk, a young woman with a bright smile greeted him. "Mrs. Whitfield is expecting you. She's in the East Wing, room 114. Would you like me to show you?" "I can find my way, thank you," Mason replied, uncomfortable with the formal treatment. As he walked down the corridor, Mason noted the plush carpeting and tasteful artwork. This place wasn't cheap, which told him something about Mrs. Whitfield's financial situation before he'd even met her properly. Room 114's door was open. Mason knocked gently on the doorframe. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's Mason Reed." A woman sat by the window, her profile illuminated by the morning sunlight. She turned at the sound of his voice, revealing a face that belonged to someone in her early 70s, handsome rather than pretty, with intelligent eyes that squinted slightly as she tried to focus on him. "Mr. Reed, please come in," she said, her Boston accent still evident despite her time in Montana. "And please call me Elaine." Mason entered the room, which was larger than he expected and furnished with what appeared to be personal pieces rather than the standard assisted living decor. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes. The scent of lavender hung in the air. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Elaine said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "I imagine you're curious about why I asked to see you?" "I'll admit I am," Mason replied, taking the offered seat. "I believe we met briefly at Palmer's Christmas party?" Elaine smiled. "Yes, we did. You made quite an impression. You spoke with such passion about your ranch and the land. Not like the others at that stuffy gathering who only talked about money and gossip." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "That's kind of you to say. I'm not one for unnecessary flattery, Mr. Reed. I'm a direct woman, and I'll get straight to the point." Elaine leaned forward slightly. "I understand you're facing foreclosure on your ranch." The statement caught Mason off guard. His financial troubles weren't exactly a secret in a small town like Pinecrest, but he didn't expect them to be of interest to a newcomer like Elaine. "News travels fast," he said tersely. "In places like this, it does," she replied, unfazed by his tone. "I have a proposition for you, one that might solve your immediate problems." Mason raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I have money, Mr. Reed. Quite a lot of it. My late husband was in finance, and he left me very well provided for. What I don't have is family or much time left." "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Mason said, though an uneasy feeling was beginning to form in his stomach. Elaine gestured toward her eyes. "I have macular degeneration. My eyesight is failing rapidly. The doctors say within a year I'll likely be legally blind. I moved to this facility because it offers assistance, but I'm not happy here. I miss having a real home, open spaces, the simple pleasures of a life less institutional." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I want to spend whatever time I have left somewhere beautiful, somewhere that feels real. Your ranch sounds like such a place. and you need money to save it. Mrs. Whitfield—" "Elaine," she corrected. "Elaine," Mason conceded. "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not looking to sell, and even if I were, the bank—" "I'm not proposing to buy your ranch, Mason," she interrupted. "I'm proposing marriage." The room fell silent. Mason stared at her, certain he had misheard. "Marriage," he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Elaine nodded, her expression calm and resolute. "A marriage of convenience, to be clear. I would provide the funds to save your ranch and establish a comfortable living for us both. In return, you would provide a home for me and basic assistance as my vision deteriorates. A companion for my final years, if you will." Mason stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Mrs. Whitfield, I appreciate the offer, but what you're suggesting—" "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Is practical," she finished for him. "We're both adults, Mason. I'm 72, you're in your 40s. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for mutual benefit. You get to keep your family legacy, and I get to live out my days in a real home with dignity and some measure of independence." Mason paced the small room, his mind racing. The proposition was outlandish, something out of another century, and yet the foreclosure deadline loomed just weeks away. "Why me?" he finally asked. "You barely know me." Elaine's expression softened. "I'm a good judge of character, Mr. Reed, always have been. It served me well in business and in life. When we spoke at that party, I saw a man of integrity, a man who loves the land and values family history. Those qualities are rare these days." She reached for a glass of water on the side table, her hand fumbling slightly before finding it. "Besides, I've made inquiries. You've never missed a day of work, even after your wife passed. You help your neighbors without being asked. You've never cheated anyone in business, even when it would have been to your advantage." The mention of Sarah made Mason's chest tighten. "And what would people think? This town loves its gossip." "People will always talk," Elaine replied dismissively. "Let them. We would know the truth of our arrangement." Mason returned to his seat, still reeling from the conversation. "And if I were to consider this, what exactly would it entail? A legal marriage? Separate bedrooms, of course. I would move to your ranch. My funds would clear your debts and provide capital for improvements. In return, you would read to me when my eyes fail completely, drive me to medical appointments, and share meals and conversation. Basic companionship." She leaned back in her chair. "I've prepared a contract that stipulates everything, including inheritance. Upon my death, the ranch and all assets would remain with you. My personal belongings and remaining funds would go to the charities designated in my will." The businesslike approach to such an intimate arrangement was jarring, but Mason had to admit there was a certain straightforward logic to it. Still, the idea of marrying a woman he barely knew, a woman 3 decades his senior, was beyond anything he had ever considered. "This is a lot to take in," he said finally. "Of course." "It is," Elaine agreed. "I don't expect an answer today. Take the contract. Review it with your lawyer if you wish, but I will need an answer within the week. My condition isn't improving, and if this arrangement isn't agreeable to you, I'll need to make other plans." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, holding it out in his general direction. Mason took it, feeling the weight of the papers inside. "One last thing," Elaine added. "I value honesty above all else. Whatever you decide, I expect the truth. No false pretenses." Mason nodded, then remembered her failing eyesight. "I understand, and I appreciate your directness." As he drove home, the envelope on the passenger seat seemed to grow heavier with each mile. The proposition was unprecedented, bizarre even. And yet, as he looked out at the fields of Eagle Ridge Ranch, at the land his ancestors had worked for generations, he couldn't dismiss it outright. That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table, the contract spread before him, illuminated by the single overhead light. The terms were clear and surprisingly generous. Elaine had thought of everything, from medical power of attorney to the specific arrangements for her care as her condition progressed. Mason picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer, James Cortez, who also happened to be one of his oldest friends. "James, it's Mason. I need your opinion on something unusual." After explaining the situation, there was a long pause on the line. "Mason, are you actually considering this?" James asked finally. "I don't know," Mason admitted. "It sounds crazy when I say it out loud." "It is crazy," James confirmed. "But from a purely legal standpoint, the contract is sound. Mrs. Whitfield's attorney clearly knows what they're doing. All your interests are protected." Mason rubbed his temples. "What would you do?" "I'm not the one about to lose my family ranch," James said softly. "Look, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this arrangement is legal, and assuming Mrs. Whitfield is of sound mind, which by your description she certainly seems to be, it would hold up in court if ever challenged." After hanging up, Mason stepped onto his porch, the cold air clearing his head somewhat. The stars above Montana were brilliant, unobscured by city lights. Sarah had loved stargazing. What would she think of this proposition? Would she understand that he was trying to save their dream? Or would she see it as a betrayal of what they had shared? The next morning, Mason found himself back at Silver Pines. This time, Elaine was sitting in a small garden courtyard, wrapped in a thick blanket. Despite the indoor temperature, she turned as a nurse announced his presence, her eyes searching for his figure. "You've made a decision," she stated rather than asked. Mason sat beside her. "How did you know?" "You strike me as a man who doesn't waste time once his mind is made." "Up," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Mason took a deep breath. "I'll do it. I'll marry you, Elaine. But I need to be clear about something. This is about saving my ranch, yes. But I also promise to honor my end of the bargain. You'll have a real home with me, and I'll care for you properly." "That's my word." Elaine reached out, her hand finding his arm unerringly. "I believe you, Mason. And I think perhaps we might find more in this arrangement than either of us anticipated. Friendship, at the very least." Within the week, the paperwork was filed, the bank notified, and a small civil ceremony arranged at the county courthouse. The news spread through Pinecrest like wildfire. Mason endured the whispers and stares with stoic dignity, focusing instead on the practical matters of preparing the ranch house for Elaine's arrival. He cleared out the guest bedroom, which had mostly been used for storage since Sarah's death. He installed grab bars in the bathroom, cleared pathways of anything Elaine might trip over, and labeled items with large print tags as the assisted living center had suggested. On a crisp March morning, Judge Harold Preston officiated their wedding in a brief 10-minute ceremony. Elaine wore a simple blue dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. Mason wore his one good suit, which still smelled faintly of mothballs. The only witnesses were James Cortez and Meredith from Silver Pines. As they signed the marriage certificate, Mason noticed how Elaine's hand trembled slightly, how close she needed to bring her face to the paper to see where to sign. It struck him then that this woman was truly vulnerable, putting her trust in him based on little more than intuition and character assessment. "Mrs. Reed," he said formally, offering his arm as they exited the courthouse, "your home awaits." Elaine took his arm, her grip firmer than he expected. "I believe it's our home now, Mr. Reed." The drive to Eagle Ridge Ranch was quiet. Mason pointed out landmarks along the way, describing the landscape as they passed. He found himself seeing the familiar scenery with new eyes, noticing details he usually took for granted as he tried to convey them to Elaine. "There's an old oak tree up ahead on the right. Must be over 200 years old. My grandfather used to say it was already ancient when his grandfather first claimed this land." "And what does it look like?" Elaine asked, leaning forward as if trying to make out the shape through her diminishing vision. "Gnarled, majestic. The trunk is so wide it would take 3 people holding hands to encircle it. The branches spread out like they're reaching for the sky. In summer, the shade covers almost a 1/4 acre. Elaine smiled. "You have a way with words when you choose to use them, Mason." As they pulled up to the ranch house, Mason felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness. The place was solid but worn, nothing like the luxury Elaine must be accustomed to. "It's not fancy," he warned as he helped her from the truck. "I don't need fancy," she replied. "Just describe it to me. Help me see it through your eyes." So he did. As they walked up the path to the front door, Mason described the wraparound porch with its swing, the fieldstone chimney, and the way the afternoon light hit the windows. Inside, he guided her slowly from room to room, detailing the layout, the history of certain pieces of furniture, the view from each window. In the kitchen, Mason pulled out a chair for Elaine. "Coffee? Or maybe tea would be better after the excitement of the day." "Tea would be lovely," she said, removing her gloves and placing them neatly on the table. As Mason filled the kettle, he glanced back at his new wife. The term still felt strange, even in his thoughts. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, taking in the sounds and smells of her new home. There was a dignity to her that commanded respect. "The kitchen is the heart of this house," he found himself saying. "My mother used to bake bread every Sunday. The whole place would smell like heaven." "Do you bake?" Elaine asked. Mason chuckled. "No, ma'am. I can grill a decent steak and make chili that won't kill you, but that's about the extent of my culinary skills." "Well, I used to be quite accomplished in the kitchen," Elaine said. "Perhaps you could be my hands, and I could teach you some recipes. I can still see enough to supervise." The suggestion took Mason by surprise. He hadn't considered that Elaine might actually contribute to daily life in ways beyond financial. "I'd like that," he said honestly. As they sipped their tea, a comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered fields. Tomorrow would bring the practical realities of their unusual arrangement. Bank meetings, paperwork, the curious eyes of neighbors. But for now, there was just this moment of quiet understanding between 2 people who had taken an extraordinary gamble on each other. "Mason," Elaine said finally, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for bringing me home." The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning neither of them fully understood yet. Mason looked at the elderly woman across from him, this stranger who was now his wife, and felt something unexpected. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of respect and perhaps even friendship. "You're welcome, Elaine," he replied, and was surprised to find he meant it. That night, as Mason showed Elaine to her room and ensured she had everything she needed, he could not have imagined that in just 3 days he would discover a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about Elaine Whitfield Reed and the bargain they had struck. The next morning, Mason woke before dawn, as he had every day for decades. For a moment, the events of the previous day seemed like a strange dream. Then he heard unfamiliar movements from down the hall, gentle footsteps, the sound of water running, and reality came flooding back. He was a married man again, to a woman he barely knew. After dressing quickly in his work clothes, Mason made his way to the kitchen, surprised to find Elaine already there. She wore a simple but elegant outfit, tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater, with her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She stood by the counter, her hands carefully feeling for the edges of objects. "Good morning," Mason said, announcing his presence so as not to startle her. Elaine turned, her eyes searching for him. "Good morning, Mason. I hope you don't mind, but I've been trying to acquaint myself with the kitchen layout." "Not at all. It's your home now, too." The words felt strange, but not entirely unwelcome. "Can I help you with something? Coffee?" "Please," she nodded. "And perhaps you could describe where everything is. If I'm to be useful around here, I need to learn the space while I still have some vision left." As Mason prepared coffee, he methodically described the kitchen, which cupboards held what, where the utensils were kept, and the peculiarities of the old gas stove. Elaine listened attentively, occasionally reaching out to touch something he mentioned, committing it to memory. "The bank appointment is at 10, Mason said as they sat at the table with their coffee. "Theodore Blake is expecting us both." "Yes. I've had my attorney transfer the funds to my account here in Pinecrest," Elaine replied. "Everything should proceed smoothly." Mason studied her face in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. There was a calmness to her features, a self-possession that spoke of a woman who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger for them. "May I ask you something personal?" he ventured. "We're married now, Mason. I think personal questions are allowed," she said with a slight smile. "Your husband, when did he pass?" Elaine's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee mug. "Jonathan died 7 years ago. Heart attack. It was quick, at least. We'd been married for 38 years. Did you have children?" A shadow crossed her face. "No. It wasn't for lack of trying in our early years. Later, we became absorbed in Jonathan's business and my charitable work. Before we knew it, the opportunity had passed." Mason nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture clearly. "Sarah and I wanted children. It just never happened for us either." "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Elaine said softly. "That's why I've learned to make my own way, as have you, I suspect." After breakfast, Mason gave Elaine a proper tour of the ranch house in daylight, describing everything in detail: the living room with its stone fireplace, the study lined with books that had belonged to his father and grandfather, the sunroom that had been his mother's pride and joy, but now housed only a few neglected plants. "It has good bones," Elaine commented, running her hand along a solid oak banister. "And it feels lived in. Not like a museum piece, but a real home." "It needs work," Mason admitted. "The roof should be replaced, the wiring updated, not to mention the barn and fences." "All things that can be addressed now," Elaine reminded him. "I believe the first transfer should clear today." At the bank, Theodore Blake couldn't hide his surprise when Mason introduced Elaine as his wife. The bank manager's eyes darted between them, confusion evident on his face despite his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Reed has transferred funds to cover the outstanding mortgage payments and wishes to pay off the remaining balance in full," Mason explained, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Theodore cleared his throat. "I see. Well, this is unexpected, but certainly welcome news. If you'll both follow me to my office, we can process the paperwork immediately." As they walked through the bank, Mason felt the stares of other customers and staff. News traveled fast in Pinecrest, but seeing the unusual couple in person was apparently still worth gawking at. He placed a protective hand on Elaine's elbow, guiding her carefully. In Theodore's office, Elaine took charge of the financial discussion with a sharpness that belied her failing eyesight. She questioned interest calculations, scrutinized closing costs, and negotiated more favorable terms with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with money. Theodore, initially condescending, quickly adjusted his tone to one of professional respect. When they left the bank an hour later, Eagle Ridge Ranch was officially free of debt for the first time in over a decade. "You handled that beautifully," Mason commented as he helped Elaine into his truck. "Money is just a tool, Mason," she replied. "Nothing more, nothing less. It's important to remember that it works for you, not the other way around. Over the next 2 days, Mason found himself increasingly intrigued by his new wife. Despite her aristocratic Boston background, Elaine adapted to ranch life with surprising ease. She insisted on learning the layout of every room, memorizing the number of steps between landmarks, and establishing routines that accommodated her vision limitations. She also asked endless questions about the ranch, its history, its operations, the challenges of modern cattle ranching. Mason found himself explaining things he'd never articulated before, forced to consider aspects of his business that had become second nature. "The drought last year hit everyone hard," he explained as they sat on the porch that evening, bundled, against the early spring chill. But the real problem started before that. Beef prices have been fluctuating wildly, feed costs are rising. Small operations like mine can't compete with the corporate ranches. "Have you considered diversification?" Elaine asked. "In business, spreading risk is often the key to longevity." The suggestion sparked a conversation that lasted well into the night. Mason found himself describing dreams he'd once had for Eagle Ridge. Organic certification, direct farm-to-table sales, perhaps even agritourism. Dreams that had withered under financial pressure and the daily grind of keeping the place afloat. "You should pursue those ideas," Elaine said firmly. "We have the capital now. All they need is your expertise and effort." The word "we" didn't escape Mason's notice. Despite the unusual circumstances of their marriage, Elaine seemed genuinely invested in the ranch's future. On the morning of their third day as husband and wife, Mason rose early as usual to tend to the few cattle he had left. When he returned to the house around midday, he was surprised to find Elaine's bedroom door still closed. He knocked gently. "Elaine, is everything all right?" No answer came. Concerned, he knocked again, louder this time. "Elaine?" When silence met his third attempt, worry overcame propriety. Mason opened the door slowly, calling her name again. The bed was empty, neatly made. Elaine's reading glasses sat on the nightstand beside a book with an oversized bookmark. Nothing seemed amiss, yet her absence was troubling. Mason checked the bathroom, then moved through the house, calling for her with increasing urgency. When he reached the kitchen, he noticed the back door was slightly ajar. Heart pounding, he rushed outside. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Elaine stood in the middle of the kitchen garden, which had lain fallow since Sarah's death. She wore gardening gloves too large for her slender hands. Sarah's gloves, Mason realized with a jolt, and was on her knees in the dirt, feeling her way along what used to be rows of vegetables. "Elaine?" Mason approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head in his direction, a streak of dirt on her cheek. "Mason, good. I could use your help. The soil here is excellent, but it needs turning. Spring planting should begin soon if we want summer vegetables." Mason knelt beside her, bewildered by the scene. "What are you doing out here? I was worried when I couldn't find you." "I'm sorry," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely apologetic. "I should have left a note. I found these gloves in the mudroom and thought I'd explore the garden beds. My mother taught me to garden by feel, you know. It's one of the few things I can still do, as my sight fails." Mason looked at the gloves on her hands. Sarah's prized gardening gloves, unused for 5 years, and felt a complex emotion rise in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a fierce protectiveness of his late wife's memory. "Those were Sarah's," he said quietly. Elaine immediately began to remove them. "I'm so sorry, Mason. I didn't know. I would never have—" "It's fine," he interrupted, surprising himself with the realization that it actually was. "They should be used. Sarah would have hated them sitting in a drawer." Elaine hesitated, then carefully put the gloves back on. "Tell me about her. About Sarah, if you don't mind." Mason sat back on his heels, looking out over the neglected garden. She loved this place, grew up on a farm 2 counties over, could ride horses before she could walk according to her father. We met at the county fair when we were both 16, married at 20. She sounds remarkable, Elaine said softly. She was. When she got sick, she fought hard, never complained, not once, even planned the spring planting from her hospital bed last year. Mason hadn't spoken about Sarah at such length to anyone. The words felt rusty, but somehow right. And, "You've kept the ranch going for her?" Elaine observed. Mason nodded, forgetting momentarily that she couldn't see the gesture clearly. It was our dream. Then it became a way to hold on to her. But lately it's felt more like a burden than a memorial. Elaine's hand found his arm, her touch light but steady. Perhaps it can be something new now, not a burden, not just a memorial, but a living legacy, something that honors the past while embracing the future. The wisdom in her words struck Mason deeply. There was something about Elaine's perspective, perhaps shaped by her own losses, her own challenges, that cut through his years of grief and inertia. "I'd like that," he said simply. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, Mason describing the layout as it had been, Elaine suggesting improvements and additions. For dinner, she taught him to make a simple pasta dish, navigating the kitchen with growing confidence, instructing him on techniques as he acted as her hands. That night, Mason lay awake thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd married a woman 3 decades his senior to save his ranch. He'd expected a business-like arrangement at best, an uncomfortable compromise at worst. Instead, he'd found something unexpected, a partnership of minds, if not hearts. Elaine brought not just financial salvation, but a fresh perspective, wisdom, and a surprising vitality to Eagle Ridge. As dawn approached, Mason made a decision. He would stop by the Pinecrest Town Hall that morning to obtain a copy of their marriage certificate for Elaine's records. It seemed like a small courtesy he could offer, a gesture acknowledging the legitimacy of their unusual union. The town. Clerk Donna Wilson had known Mason since elementary school. Her eyes widened when he made his request. "Marriage certificate for Mason and Elaine Reed," she repeated, typing into her computer. "That would have been filed this past Monday." "That's right," Mason confirmed. Donna clicked through several screens, her brow furrowing. "That's strange. I'm not seeing it in the system. We were married by Judge Preston. James Cortez was there as a witness, along with Meredith from Silver Pines." "Hold on." Donna picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Judge Preston. Donna, here. Did you officiate a wedding for Mason Reed and Elaine Whitfield on Monday?" She listened for a moment, then looked at Mason with confusion. "I see, thank you." She hung up and turned to Mason with an apologetic expression. "Judge Preston says he hasn't performed any weddings this week. Are you sure about the date?" Mason felt as though the floor had tilted beneath him. "Of course I'm sure. I was there. We signed the papers. James witnessed it." "Let me call James," Donna suggested, already calling his number. Mason waited, a cold uneasiness spreading through him. Something was very wrong. Donna's conversation with James was brief. When she hung up, her expression had shifted from confusion to concern. "James says he hasn't seen you since last month, Mason. He's worried about you." Mason stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. I need to go." He drove back to the ranch in a state of bewildered anger. What kind of game was being played here? Had James and Judge Preston been pressured to deny the wedding? But why? And by whom? As he pulled up to the house, he spotted Elaine sitting on the porch swing, a large print book open on her lap. She looked up at the sound of his truck, her face brightening. Mason approached slowly, studying her with new wariness. "I went to get a copy of our marriage certificate this morning," he said without preamble. Elaine marked her place in the book and set it aside. "That was thoughtful of you. Did you encounter some problem? You could say that. Mason remained, standing, unwilling to sit beside her until he understood what was happening. According to town records, Judge Preston and apparently James, our wedding never happened. Elaine was silent for a long moment. Then, to Mason's astonishment, she smiled sadly. I was wondering when this moment would come. Perhaps it's better, this way, to have it out in the open now rather than later. What are you talking about? Mason demanded, his patience fraying. What's going on, Elaine? She gestured to the space beside her on the swing. Please sit, Mason. This will take some explaining, and I'd rather not strain to see your expressions. Reluctantly, Mason sat, maintaining as much distance as the swing allowed. We are not legally married, Mason, Elaine said calmly. There was no judge, no witnesses, no legally binding ceremony. The words hit Mason like a physical blow. But I remember it. We were there at the courthouse. You wore a blue dress. We signed papers. Elaine shook her head gently. No, Mason, that didn't happen. Not in reality. Then what? Mason struggled to form coherent questions as his mind reeled. The bank, the mortgage, the money is real, Elaine assured him. I did transfer funds to clear your debts. The ranch is secure, but our marriage is a fiction. Mason stood again, unable to remain still. Why? Why go through this elaborate charade? Why not just offer to help me financially if that was your intention? Would you have accepted? Elaine asked simply. Would your pride have allowed you to take charity from a stranger? The question struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Mason had always been fiercely independent, sometimes to his own detriment. That still doesn't explain why you'd pretend to marry me, he insisted, or how you made me believe it happened when it didn't. Elaine sighed deeply, folding her hands in her lap. Mason, please sit down again. The full truth is more complicated. And it begins with this. My eyesight is not failing due to macular degeneration. In fact, my vision is perfectly fine. Mason stared at her, trying to process this new revelation. You've been pretending to be going blind? But why would anyone do that? I haven't been pretending anything, Elaine replied. You've been experiencing a carefully constructed delusion, one that I created, yes, but not through any deception on my part. That's impossible, Mason whispered, even as doubt crept into his mind. The memories of the past 3 days seemed real. Elaine moving carefully through the house, squinting to read, needing descriptions of her surroundings. But other memories now struck him as strange. How had Theodore Blake processed a mortgage, a payoff, without questioning their marital status? How had he not noticed that the judge's chambers had been empty of other staff during their supposed ceremony? What did you do to me? He asked, his voice hoarse. I gave you what you needed most, Elaine replied. Hope, purpose, a way forward that your pride would accept. Mason took an involuntary step back. Who are you, really? Elaine stood, and as she did, her posture changed subtly. The slight hesitation in her movements vanished. Her eyes, which had seemed to struggle to focus on him, now met his gaze directly and with perfect clarity. My name is Dr. Elaine Whitfield. I'm a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and grief recovery, and I'm here because your sister Caroline asked me to help you, Mason, before it was too late. Mason felt as though he'd been plunged into ice water. Caroline, my sister, she's in Seattle. We haven't spoken in years. You haven't spoken because you shut her out after Sarah died, Elaine corrected gently, but she never stopped caring about you. When she heard through mutual friends that you were about to lose the ranch, that you were drinking heavily and refusing help from anyone, she contacted me. This is insane, Mason muttered, running a hand through his hair. You're saying my sister hired you to, what? Trick me? Manipulate me? To help you break through the walls you've built, Elaine replied, her voice steady. Caroline tried everything else. Phone calls, letters, even coming to see you last Christmas, though you probably don't remember that visit clearly. You were quite intoxicated. A hazy memory surfaced. Caroline at his door, tears in her eyes. Mason turning her away with harsh words he couldn't now recall. The technique I used is experimental, Elaine continued, a form of immersive therapy designed for patients who cannot be reached through conventional methods. It creates a shared narrative, a temporary reality that allows the patient to confront their issues from a safe emotional distance. So none of this was real? Mason gestured around them, his voice rising. The bank, the marriage, all of it was some kind of elaborate mind game. The physical reality is real, Elaine clarified. We are standing on your porch. Your ranch exists. Your financial troubles exist. What wasn't real was the specific narrative of our marriage and my condition. That was a therapeutic construct designed to give you a way to accept help without feeling diminished by it. Mason struggled to breathe, his world shifting beneath him. How is this even possible? You can't just make someone believe something that didn't happen. The mind is more flexible than most people realize, Elaine said, especially when under severe stress, as you have been. The combination of grief, financial pressure, isolation, and alcohol created a vulnerability that allowed for this approach. The technique involves a form of guided hypnotherapy coupled with carefully calibrated suggestions. You drugged me, Mason accused. No drugs were involved, Elaine said firmly. Just words, timing, and your own desperate need for a solution. When I met you at the Palmer's Christmas party, I was already assessing whether you would be responsive to this treatment. Our conversation about the ranch gave me the framework to build upon. Mason sank onto the porch steps, his legs no longer able to support him. The past 3 days replayed in his mind, now tinged with doubt and new perspective. So there's no money? The ranch is still going to be foreclosed? The money is absolutely real, Elaine assured him, remaining where she stood. Caroline provided. Funds to clear your debts. That part was always genuine. The bank has been paid. Eagle Ridge Ranch is secure. Why the elaborate story then? Why not just tell me my sister wanted to help? Because you had rejected her help repeatedly, Elaine explained. Your pride wouldn't allow you to accept what you saw as charity, especially from the younger sister you've always felt responsible for. The narrative of a marriage of convenience gave you a way to accept financial help while maintaining your dignity. It reframed the assistance as a fair exchange rather than charity. Mason struggled to process everything. So what happens now? You just leave? Go back to Boston and write up my case for some medical journal? Elaine's expression softened. That depends on you, Mason. The initial phase of the therapy is complete. You've begun to engage with the world again, to think about the future of the ranch, to speak about Sarah. Those were the first goals. What happens next is your choice. My choice? Mason laughed bitterly. After you've manipulated my perception of reality without my consent? Yes, Elaine said simply. Your choice. Because despite the unorthodox methods, everything that's happened these past 3 days has been in service of giving you back your autonomy. Your sister's financial help has removed the immediate crisis, but what you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you. Mason stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the fields of Eagle Ridge, the land that had been in his family for 4 generations, the home he had shared with Sarah, the dream they had built together that had nearly slipped through his fingers. And Caroline? Where is she now? In Seattle, waiting to hear if her brother is ready to let her back into his life, Elaine replied. She loves you, Mason. She just didn't know how to reach you anymore. Mason turned back to face Elaine, Dr. Whitfield, seeing her clearly now. Not an elderly widow with failing eyesight, but a woman in her early 60s, sharp-eyed and composed, watching him with professional concern tinged with genuine compassion. I should be furious with you, he said slowly. With both of you. You have every right to be, she acknowledged. What we did was ethically questionable at best, even with the best of intentions. And yet, Mason paused, searching for words to articulate his confused thoughts. These past 3 days have been the first time since Sarah died that I've felt present, like I was actually living instead of just existing. Elaine nodded, but remained silent, allowing him space to work through his feelings. The plans for the ranch, the conversations we had, was any of that real? He asked finally. All of it was real, she assured him. My questions, your answers, the ideas you shared, those came from you, Mason. I simply created a context where you felt safe enough to express them. Mason rubbed his face with his hands, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. I need time to think, to process all this. Of course, Elaine agreed. I've taken a room at the Pinecrest Inn. I'll be there for the next 2 days if you wish to talk further. After that, I'll return to Boston, regardless of your decision. She moved toward the steps, then paused beside him. For what it's worth, I believe Sarah would be proud of the man I've glimpsed these past few days, the man who spoke so lovingly of her in the garden, the man who's still here, beneath the grief and anger, ready to live again when you're ready to let him. With that, she descended the porch steps and walked to a rental car Mason hadn't noticed before, parked at the edge of the property. He watched. As she drove away, his mind a storm of confusion, betrayal, anger, and, most surprising of all, a flicker of gratitude he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Inside the house, Mason went directly to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The bottle of bourbon was there, 3/4 full. He stared at it for a long moment, then deliberately closed the drawer without taking it out. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart but hadn't called in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Hello? Mason took a deep breath. Caroline. It's Mason. I think we need to talk. Mason? Is that really you? Caroline's voice wavered between disbelief and hope. Mason gripped the phone tighter, suddenly unsure what to say to the sister he'd pushed away for so long. Yeah, it's me. Are you okay? Has something happened? The concern in her voice made his chest tighten with guilt. I just met your Dr. Whitfield, he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Quite a way to reach out, Care. The line went silent for a moment. Oh, Caroline finally breathed. I wasn't sure. I mean, she said it might not work, and even if it did, you might hate me forever for it. I'm not sure what I feel right now, Mason admitted. But hate isn't it. Can I come see you? Caroline asked, the words tumbling out quickly as if she feared losing her chance. I can be on a flight tomorrow, or even tonight. I've been keeping my schedule flexible just in case. Mason closed his eyes, picturing his sister, still 25 in his mind, though she must be 34 now, dark hair like their mother's, the same stubborn reed chin. Yeah, I think that would be good. After arranging the details of her flight, Mason hung up and stood by the window, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains. The ranch looked different somehow, as if seeing it through Elaine's, Dr. Whitfield's, eyes had changed his perception. The peeling paint on the barn wasn't just neglect now. It was a project waiting to be tackled. The fallow fields weren't. A reminder of failure, but an opportunity unrealized. He spent the evening in a strange state of calm, methodically going through the house and seeing it with new clarity. In the kitchen, he found a shopping list written in Elaine's elegant script, ingredients for meals they had planned to prepare together. In the study, there were books she had selected with large print, now unnecessary given her revelation. Each discovery should have fueled his sense of betrayal, but instead, they served as reminders of the genuine connections they had formed despite the false premise. When he reached Sarah's garden, now partially cleared thanks to their afternoons Work. Mason sat on the old stone bench and watched the twilight deepen. For the first time in years, memories of Sarah brought more comfort than pain. He could almost hear her practical voice. "Well, it's unconventional, but it worked, didn't it? You're still here. The ranch is safe. What are you going to do now?" "Mason Reed." The next morning, Mason drove into Pinecrest and parked outside the bank. Theodore Blake looked up in surprise when Mason entered his office without appointment. "Mason, what can I do for you?" "I need to verify something," Mason said, sitting across from him. "My mortgage. Has it paid off?" Theodore blinked, then turned to his computer. "Let me check your accounts." He typed briefly, then frowned at the screen. "According to our records, your outstanding balance was settled in full yesterday. The payment came from—" He squinted at the screen. "A Caroline Reed." Mason exhaled slowly. That part, at least, was true. "And did I come in here with anyone recently? An older woman?" Theodore looked at him strangely. "No, Mason, I haven't. Seen you in person since last month when we discussed the foreclosure deadline. The payment was processed electronically." He leaned forward with concern. "Is everything all right? You seem disoriented." "Just checking the details," Mason replied, rising to leave. "Been a confusing few days." His next stop was the Silver Pines Assisted Living Center. The receptionist smiled brightly as he approached. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm looking for information about a resident named Elaine Whitfield," Mason said. The receptionist checked her computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have anyone by that name residing here." "She might have been here temporarily? In the last week or so?" Mason pressed. "Let me check our visitor and short-term stay logs." After a brief search, she shook her head. "No record of Elaine Whitfield visiting or staying here." "Are you sure you have the right facility?" Mason thanked her and walked out, his confusion deepening. If Elaine had never been at Silver Pines, how had this elaborate scenario begun? He tried to recall the phone call that had supposedly come from Meredith at the center, but the memory was hazy at best. His final stop was the Pinecrest Inn, a modest two-story building on the edge of town. The desk clerk confirmed that a Dr. Elaine Whitfield was indeed a current guest and directed him to room 214. Mason stood outside her door for a full minute before knocking, gathering his thoughts. When the door opened, Elaine, Dr. Whitfield, looked unsurprised to see him. "Mason," she said simply, stepping back to let him enter. The hotel room was standard but made homier by a few personal touches. A cashmere throw over the armchair, a selection of books on the desk, a small vase of fresh wildflowers. Dr. Whitfield was dressed casually in slacks and a sweater, looking more like a visiting professor than the elderly woman he had believed her to be. "I've been checking your story," Mason said without preamble. "The bank confirmed Caroline paid off my mortgage. Silver Pines has never heard of you." "No, they wouldn't have," she agreed, gesturing for him to sit. "That part of the narrative was constructed. There was no phone call from Meredith. I approached you directly at your ranch, though you don't remember it that way." Mason remained standing. "How is that possible? How could you make me believe something that never happened?" Dr. Whitfield sat in the armchair, her movements deliberate. "The technique is called immersive narrative therapy. It was developed for patients with severe PTSD who couldn't engage with traditional therapeutic approaches. It creates a framework, a story, that the patient's mind can accept and work within." "That doesn't explain how you did it," Mason insisted. "No, it doesn't," she acknowledged. "The full methodology is complex and, frankly, controversial within my field. It involves elements of hypnotherapy, carefully timed suggestions, and leveraging moments of vulnerability. In your case, I first met you when you were at an emotional breaking point. The day after your visit to the bank when you learned foreclosure was imminent." Mason tried to recall that day, but his memories were jumbled. He remembered drinking heavily after leaving Theodore's office, sitting on his porch watching the sunset with a bottle of bourbon. You were intoxicated when I arrived, Dr. Whitfield continued, as if reading his thoughts. That created an ideal state for the initial narrative implantation. I introduced myself as a new resident in town, expressed interest in your ranch, and suggested we continue our conversation the next day. You agreed, though you likely have no memory of this. And the next day you... What? Hypnotized me into believing you were a half-blind widow who wanted to marry me? Mason's voice rose with incredulity. It wasn't that direct or simple. She replied calmly, I returned when you were sober but still vulnerable, sleep-deprived, stressed, desperate for a solution. I presented a narrative that addressed your immediate needs while protecting your sense of dignity. Your mind, seeking relief from overwhelming anxiety, accepted the framework I offered. Mason finally sat, his legs no longer steadying him reliably. That's terrifying. If you could do this to me, who else could? Very few people, Dr. Whitfield assured him. I've spent 30 years developing this approach, and it only works under specific circumstances with receptive individuals. Your combination of grief, isolation, financial stress, and intermittent alcohol use created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Most people, under normal conditions, would be highly resistant. Why not just offer conventional therapy? Or has Caroline approached me directly? Dr. Whitfield's expression softened. Your sister tried conventional approaches multiple times. You refused counseling, rejected her financial help, and even turned her away when she came to see you. She was desperate, Mason. She believed you were on the verge of suicide. The blunt assessment hit Mason like a physical blow. Has he been that far gone? He thought back to the night before, meeting Elaine at Silver Pines, sitting on his porch, with the bourbon and his father's old revolver on the table beside him. He'd told himself he was just cleaning the gun, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. The technique creates a temporary narrative bridge, Dr. Whitfield continued. It allows the patient to accept help and begin healing from an oblique angle when direct approaches have failed. Once the initial crisis is resolved and healthier patterns are established, the constructed narrative can be gently dismantled, as we did yesterday. Nothing about yesterday felt gentle, Mason muttered. I apologize for that, she said sincerely. Ideally, the revelation would have come later, after more groundwork had been laid. But when you went to obtain our non-existent marriage certificate, it forced my hand. Mason rubbed his temples, trying to reconcile his memories with what he now knew to be reality. So everything I remember about the past 3 days, the wedding, the bank meeting with you there, our conversations about the ranch, none of that actually happened. The conversations happened, Dr. Whitfield clarified, just not in the context you remember. We did discuss the ranch's potential, Sarah's garden, and your history. Those discussions were real, even if the framework around them was constructed. And the garden, did we actually work on it together? Yes, she confirmed, though I wasn't pretending to have failing eyesight at the time. Your perception of me was altered, but our actions were real. Mason stood and faced the small room, trying to process everything. Why reveal the truth now? Why not just leave town and let me believe the story? Wouldn't that have been kinder, in a way? Dr. Whitfield shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. The narrative was only ever meant to be temporary, a therapeutic scaffold to help you through the immediate crisis. Leaving you in a false reality would be deeply unethical and potentially harmful long-term. The goal was always to transition you back to reality once you were better equipped to handle it. So where do I go from here? Mason asked, suddenly, feeling adrift. How do I know what's real anymore? What's real is that you still have your ranch thanks to your sister's generosity, Dr. Whitfield replied. What's real is that for the first time in years, you've begun thinking about the future again. Improvements to the property, diversification, new beginnings. What's real is that you called Caroline last night, breaking the isolation you've imposed on yourself since Sarah's death." She leaned forward, her gaze direct and unwavering. "The narrative framework may have been constructed, Mason, but the progress you've made is entirely genuine." Mason stood by the window, looking out at Pinecrest's main street. People were going about their ordinary lives, stopping at the post office, chatting on street corners, running errands. His world had been turned upside down, yet everything outside continued as normal. "I'm still angry," he said finally. "At you, Caroline, at this whole situation. But I also understand why you both did it. And I can't deny that whatever happened these past few days, it helped." "Anger is a healthy response," Dr. Whitfield acknowledged. "I would be concerned if you weren't angry. But I hope, with time, you'll also recognize that this intervention came from a place of deep caring." Mason turned back to face her. "I need to know everything. Every moment you manipulated, every false memory you created. I need to sort out what's real and what isn't." "Of course," she agreed readily. "That's an essential part of the resolution phase. I can walk you through the entire process, help you identify constructed memories versus genuine experiences. It will take time, but it's necessary for your complete recovery." For the next 2 hours, Dr. Whitfield methodically deconstructed the narrative she had created, explaining when and how she had shaped Mason's perceptions. Some revelations were shocking. He had never actually been to the courthouse or signed any marriage documents. Others were more subtle. Their conversations had occurred, but his perception of her appearance and their relationship had been altered. By the time they finished, Mason felt mentally exhausted, but also strangely unburdened. The world made sense again, even if it wasn't the world he had believed in 3 days ago. "Caroline arrives tomorrow," he said, as he prepared to leave. "Will you stay to meet with us both?" Dr. Whitfield nodded. "If you want me to, yes. It might be helpful for both of you to have a mediated conversation about what's happened and what comes next." The next morning, Mason drove to the regional airport to meet Caroline's flight. As passengers streamed through the arrival gate, he suddenly realized he might not recognize his sister after 9 years of estrangement. But then he saw her, older, more polished in her business attire, but unmistakably Caroline with their mother's eyes and their father's determined walk. She spotted him at the same moment and froze briefly before rushing forward. Mason opened his arms without hesitation, and she collided with him in a fierce hug that knocked the breath from his lungs. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she murmured against his shoulder. "I wasn't sure either until I was in the truck," Mason admitted, stepping back to look at her properly. "You grew up, Care." She smiled tremulously. 9 years will do that." Her expression sobered. "I'm so sorry about everything with Dr. Whitfield. I was desperate and scared for you, but I should have found another way. We can talk about that later," Mason said, taking her suitcase. "Let's get you home first." The drive back to Eagle Ridge Ranch was initially awkward, years of silence creating a chasm between them. But gradually, as the Montana landscape unfolded around them, they began to bridge the gap with careful questions and honest answers. "After Mom and Dad died, and then Sarah, I just couldn't handle anyone else's grief on top of my own," Mason explained as they approached the ranch. "It was easier to push everyone away than to risk more loss." "I understand that now," Caroline said. "Back then, I just felt abandoned. First by our parents, then by you. I was 25, but felt about 15. Trying to navigate life without any family left." Mason winced at the pain in her voice. "I failed you. I was supposed to be the big brother who looked out for you, and instead I disappeared when you needed me most." "We both made mistakes," Caroline said gently. "But we're here now, trying to fix things. That's what matters." As they pulled up to the ranch house, Mason noticed Caroline tense slightly. "What is it?" he asked. "It's just..." Exactly the same, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Like stepping back in time. I half expect Mom to come out the door wiping her hands on her apron, or Dad to call out from the barn. Mason saw the property through her eyes. A time capsule of their shared childhood, preserved almost exactly as it had been when their parents were alive. Even the changes made during his years with Sarah had been subtle, respectful of the ranch's history. It's home, he said simply. It's always been your home too, Care. I should never have made you feel unwelcome here. Dr. Whitfield was waiting for them on the porch when they arrived, having driven from town separately. Caroline approached her with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. "Thank you for helping my brother," she said, extending her hand. "Though I'm still not entirely comfortable with the methods. Nor should you be," Dr. Whitfield replied frankly, shaking her hand. "What we attempted was highly unconventional and ethically complex, but I believe in this case the end justifies the means. Your brother is here, the ranch is secure, and you have a chance to rebuild your relationship." The three of them spent the afternoon on the porch, talking through everything that had happened. Dr. Whitfield moderated when necessary, but mostly allowed the siblings to lead the conversation, working through 9 years of misunderstandings and hurt feelings. "The money for the ranch isn't a loan, Mason," Caroline insisted when the topic of finances arose. "It's an investment in our family legacy. I've done well in Seattle, better than I ever let you know. This place means as much to me as it does to you." "I still want to pay you back," Mason said stubbornly. "Maybe not all at once, but over time." Caroline exchanged a glance with Dr. Whitfield. "How about this? You don't pay me back with money. You pay me back by making this place thrive again, by being my brother again, by letting me be part of Eagle Ridge's future." Mason looked out over the fields, considering her offer. The ideas he'd discussed with Elaine about diversification and modernization floated back into his mind. "I could use a business partner with your skills," he admitted. "Someone who understands numbers better than I do." "I can commute from Seattle for a while," Caroline suggested, excitement creeping into her voice. "Maybe eventually split my time between both places. My company has been moving toward remote work anyway." As the conversation turned toward practical plans for the ranch's future, Dr. Whitfield quietly excused herself. Mason walked her to her car. "You're leaving?" he asked. "My work here is done," she replied simply. "You have what you need now. Your ranch, your sister, and most importantly, a way forward." Mason studied her face, still reconciling this reality with the constructed memories of Elaine that lingered in his mind. "I still don't entirely approve of your methods, Doctor." "I wouldn't expect you to," she said with a small smile. "Healthy skepticism is a sign of recovery." "But," Mason continued, "I can't argue with the results. A week ago, I was contemplating the end of everything. Now I'm planning for the future. That counts for something." Dr. Whitfield nodded. "Healing isn't always a gentle process, Mason. Sometimes it requires a significant disruption to break unhealthy patterns. Your mind needs a new narrative to find its way out of grief and isolation." She handed him a business card. "My contact information, should you need it. I've also recommended a local therapist who can provide ongoing support as you process everything. This is just the beginning of your recovery journey." Mason accepted the card, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Will you tell other people about what happened here? Use me as a case study or something?" "With your permission and appropriate anonymization, yes. The technique needs further research and refinement. Your experience could help others in similar situations." Mason nodded slowly. "I think Sarah would approve of that. Using something painful to help others was always her way." As Dr. Whitfield prepared to leave, she paused with her hand on the car door. "There's one more thing you should know, Mason. While the narrative framework was constructed, the connections we formed were genuine. I didn't falsify my reactions or my concern for you. In my profession, we have to maintain boundaries, but that doesn't mean we don't care deeply about our patients' well-being. I believe you, Mason said, surprising himself with the realization that it was true. Safe travels, Doctor. He watched her drive away, then turned back toward the house where Caroline waited on the porch. The future stretched before him, uncertain and challenging, but no longer empty. The ranch that had been slipping through his fingers was now secure. The sister he had pushed away was back in his life. The crushing isolation of the past 5 years had been broken. Mason took a deep breath of the crisp Montana air and felt, for the first time since Sarah's death, a sense of possibility rather than loss. The memories Dr. Whitfield had created would fade with time, but the changes she had catalyzed would remain, a strange gift from an unexpected source. "Hey," Caroline called from the porch. "Come look at these plans I've been sketching. I think we could convert the North Pasture into an organic operation by next spring." Mason smiled and walked toward his sister, toward the ranch house, toward whatever came next. "I'm coming," he called back. "Let's get started." 6 months had passed. Since Dr. Whitfield's departure from Pinecrest, the Montana summer had bloomed in full glory across Eagle Ridge Ranch, transforming the once neglected property into a hive of activity and renewal. Mason stood at the edge of the North Pasture, watching as workers installed the last section of fencing for what would soon be certified organic grazing land. The morning sun warmed his face as he took a deep drink from his coffee mug. Not bourbon, not anymore. Not since that pivotal week in early spring that had changed everything. "They're making good progress," Caroline observed, joining him with her own mug of coffee. At 34, his sister had proven herself not just a savvy businesswoman, but an inspired visionary for the ranch's future. Her weekend commutes from Seattle had evolved into 3-week stays at Eagle Ridge, with just 1 week per month at her condo in the city. "Should be done by Thursday," Mason agreed, "just in time for the inspection next week." The organic certification was Caroline's idea, part of her comprehensive plan to diversify the ranch's income streams. The premium prices for organic beef would help stabilize their finances, while the high-end farm-to-table program she'd developed had already attracted interest from restaurants as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. "Have you decided about the farmers market proposal?" Caroline asked, nudging a stone with the toe of her boot. Mason nodded. "I think we should do it. Starting small this fall with whatever late harvest we can manage, then go full scale next." "Spring!" Caroline's smile was worth any lingering doubts he might have harbored. "The greenhouse arrives next Tuesday. We can have it assembled by the end of the month, which gives us plenty of time for fall seedlings." They walked together along the perimeter of the pasture, a comfortable silence between them. The relationship they were rebuilding wasn't the same as the one they'd had as children, or even as young adults, before Sarah's illness. It was something new. A partnership of equals, founded on hard-earned wisdom and a shared vision for their family legacy. "We got another email from Dr. Whitfield," Caroline mentioned casually, though Mason detected the careful tone beneath her nonchalance. "What does she want?" he asked, keeping his own voice neutral. "Just checking in. She's presenting a paper at a conference in Bozeman next month and wondered if we'd be open to a visit." Mason stopped walking, staring out over the land that had nearly slipped through his fingers. His relationship with Dr. Whitfield remained complicated. The immersive therapy she'd conducted had saved him from financial ruin and possibly from taking his own life, but the methods she'd employed still troubled him on a fundamental level. "What do you think?" he asked finally. Caroline shrugged. "I think it might be good closure for both of us, and I'm curious to hear about her research, how what happened here might help others." Mason nodded slowly. "Tell her she's welcome to visit, but make it clear this is about professional courtesy, not friendship." "Fair enough," Caroline agreed. As they turned back toward the house, Mason's phone rang. He checked the display and felt a familiar tension return to his shoulders. "It's Patricia Donovan." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "The third time this week. Are you going to keep avoiding her?" "I'm not avoiding her," Mason protested unconvincingly. "I've been busy." "Uh-huh," Caroline smirked. "It has nothing to do with the fact that she's asked you to the Harvest Festival 3 years running, and this is the first year you might actually say yes." Mason shot his sister an annoyed glance, but answered the call. "Patricia, good morning." Patricia Donovan owned Willow Creek Ranch, the neighboring property to the east. A widow herself, she had taken over the ranch after her husband's death 8 years ago and transformed it into one of the most successful operations in the county. She was practical, straightforward, and, as Caroline frequently pointed out, clearly interested in Mason. The conversation was brief, an issue with water rights that affected both their properties, a proposal for a joint meeting with the county commissioner next week. As Mason ended the call, he noticed Caroline watching him with an amused expression. "What?" he challenged. "Nothing," she said innocently. "Just wondering when you're going to stop hiding behind ranch business and actually have a real conversation with the woman." Mason pocketed his phone. "Not everyone needs a romantic entanglement to be fulfilled, Care." "Entanglement?" Caroline laughed. "Good Lord, you sound like you're discussing barbed wire, not a potential relationship with an intelligent, attractive neighbor who clearly admires you." Mason started walking again, quickening his pace slightly. "It's been 5 years since Sarah. 6 months since I nearly lost everything. I'm still putting the pieces back together." Caroline caught up easily. "I know, and I'm not pushing. But at some point you might want to consider that moving forward doesn't mean leaving Sarah behind. It just means creating a life she'd be proud to see you living." Her words hit closer to home than Mason wanted to admit. In the months since Dr. Whitfield's intervention, he'd begun to process his grief in healthier ways. The weekly sessions with Dr. Leland, the local therapist Dr. Whitfield had recommended, had helped him understand that honoring Sarah's memory didn't require sacrificing his own future on the altar of grief. Back at the ranch house, Mason headed to his study while Caroline made calls from the kitchen table that now served as her remote office. The room that had once been his refuge for solitary drinking had transformed alongside him. The drawer that had housed bourbon now contained farm management software manuals. The dusty shelves had been organized, the blinds replaced with curtains that let in natural light. On his desk sat a framed photograph of Sarah, smiling from the porch swing on their first anniversary. Beside it, a newer addition, a picture of him and Caroline at the spring cattle auction, their first public appearance together since her return to his life. The two images represented different chapters of the same story, no longer in competition, but in harmony. Mason sat down to review the latest financial projections Caroline had prepared. The numbers were promising, not an overnight miracle, but a steady path towards stability and even modest growth. By this time next year, if all went according to plan, Eagle Ridge Ranch would not only be solvent, but profitable for the first time in a decade. A knock at the open door interrupted his thoughts. Caroline leaned against the doorframe. "I've been thinking about Dr. Whitfield's visit next month." "And?" Mason prompted when she hesitated. "I think we should invite her to stay here, at the ranch, not at the Pinecrest Inn." Mason leaned back, in his chair, surprised by the suggestion. "Why would we do that?" Caroline entered the study fully, settling into the leather armchair across from his desk. "Because I think it matters, symbolically, that she sees what her intervention actually accomplished, not just hear about it or observe it from a distance, but experience it firsthand. The ranch as it is now, not as it was then." Mason considered this. There was wisdom in Caroline's proposal, though he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of Dr. Whitfield under his roof again, this time as herself, not as the elderly widow Elaine he had believed her to be. "You're suggesting we use her own methodology against her," he observed with a slight smile. "Create an immersive experience that tells our story on our terms." Caroline grinned. "Something like that, though without the questionable ethics or manipulation of reality." Mason laughed despite himself. "All right, invite her to stay. But in the guest room this time, not Sarah's old room." "Of course," Caroline agreed, standing to leave. "Oh, and I scheduled that meeting with Patricia and the Commissioner for Tuesday at 10, at her place, not ours." Before Mason could protest, she was gone, leaving him to wonder when exactly his younger sister had become so adept at managing both their business affairs and his personal life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The organic certification process required meticulous documentation and several property inspections. The greenhouse arrived and was assembled with the help of neighbors in an old-fashioned barn-raising atmosphere. Mason found himself reconnecting with the community in ways he hadn't since before Sarah's illness, accepting invitations to dinners, offering assistance with mechanical issues, even attending church again for the first time in years. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that had been lost in grief and isolation. Dr. Leland called it reintegration, the process of becoming whole again after trauma had fractured his sense of self and place in the world. The meeting with Patricia Donovan and the county commissioner went smoothly, resulting in a water management agreement that benefited both ranches. As they were wrapping up, Patricia invited Mason to stay for lunch. "Nothing fancy," she assured him, her practical manner one of the things he'd always appreciated about her. "But I made too much stew yesterday, and it's always better the second day." Mason found himself accepting without the usual hesitation. Patricia's kitchen was warm and inviting, with a large picture window overlooking her prized horse pasture. Unlike his own ranch house, which was steeped in generations of Reed family history, Patricia's home reflected her own sensibilities, comfortable, efficient, without pretension. "Caroline seems to be settling in well," Patricia commented as they ate. "The organic certification was a smart move." "It was her idea," Mason admitted, "along with most of the changes we're implementing. Turns out my sister inherited our mother's head for business." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Smart woman. You're lucky to have her back in your life." "I am," Mason agreed, "though I'm not sure luck had much to do with it." Something in his tone must have invited further inquiry, because Patricia set down her spoon and regarded him thoughtfully. "There's quite a story there, isn't there? About how she came back." Mason hesitated. Few people in Pinecrest knew the full truth about Dr. Whitfield's intervention. Most assumed Caroline had simply reconciled with him during his financial crisis, returning to help save the family ranch. The wild rumors about a marriage to a wealthy widow had faded quickly when no such person materialized in town. "It's complicated," he said finally, "and more than a little unusual." "I've got time," Patricia replied, refilling their water glasses, "if you want to talk about it." To his surprise, Mason found that he did want to talk about it, not in the clinical setting of Dr. Leland's office, but here in this sunlit kitchen with a woman who had navigated her own journey through grief and rebuilding. He told her everything. The foreclosure threat, Caroline's desperate outreach to Dr. Whitfield, the elaborate therapeutic narrative that had convinced him he'd married an elderly widow with failing eyesight, and the shocking revelation 3 days later that none of it had been real. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to concern to thoughtful consideration. "That's quite a violation of trust," she said when he finished, "even if the intention was good." That's how I felt initially, Mason acknowledged. Angry, manipulated, but as time passed, I've come to see it differently. Dr. Whitfield created a scenario where I could accept help without feeling diminished by it, where I could start thinking about the future again without betraying the past. Patricia nodded slowly. Grief makes us build walls. Sometimes they're so high we can't see a way over them ourselves. Exactly, Mason said, relieved by her understanding. Dr. Whitfield found a way around my walls when going through them wasn't an option. She's coming to visit next month? Patricia asked. Yes. Caroline thinks we should have her stay at the ranch, see the results of her intervention firsthand. Patricia smiled. Your sister continues to impress me. That's a powerful gesture, acknowledging what happened without necessarily condoning the methods. As Mason drove home later that afternoon, he realized he'd shared more about his experience with Patricia than with anyone other than Caroline and Dr. Leland. There was something about her directness, her lack of judgment, that made vulnerability feel less frightening. When he arrived at the ranch, he found Caroline in Sarah's garden, which they had fully restored over the summer. She was harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes, a wide-brimmed hat protecting her from the late afternoon. "Son, how did it go with Patricia?" she asked, looking up as his shadow fell across the garden bed. "Good," Mason replied, kneeling to help her. "The water agreement is settled, and I stayed for lunch." Caroline raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, focusing on selecting ripe tomatoes with exaggerated concentration. "I told her about Dr. Whitfield," Mason added. "Everything." This got his sister's full attention. "Everything. The marriage, the therapy, all of it." Mason nodded, placing a particularly fine tomato in her basket. It felt right. She's experienced loss too, rebuilt her life afterward. There's a perspective there that's valuable. Caroline smiled knowingly. "I've always liked Patricia. Good head on her shoulders." "Don't start planning the wedding just yet," Mason warned, though without any real annoyance. "One step at a time." "Of course," Caroline agreed innocently. "Absolutely. No pressure. Though I should mention she makes an excellent apple pie, and her ranch borders ours to the east, which would make a natural expansion if the operations were ever to merge." Mason tossed a small green tomato at her, which she dodged with a laugh. That evening, Caroline sent their response to Dr. Whitfield, inviting her to stay at Eagle Ridge during her visit to Montana. The reply came the next morning, a gracious acceptance and apparent surprise at the offer. Over the following weeks, Mason found himself increasingly curious about the upcoming visit. What would it be like to interact with Dr. Whitfield as herself, not as the constructed persona of Elaine? Would the memories of that strange 3-day period feel more or less surreal in her actual presence? He also found himself stopping by Willow Creek Ranch more frequently, sometimes with legitimate business, sometimes with transparently flimsy pretexts that Patricia accepted with good-humored patience. Their conversations ranged from practical ranch management to books they'd both enjoyed to more personal reflections on loss and recovery. "Sarah would have liked you," Mason told her one evening, as they sat on her porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Patricia seemed to understand the significance of this statement. "I wish I could have known her. From everything you've said, she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Mason agreed, feeling the familiar ache of loss, but without the crushing weight it had once carried. "The kind of person who made everyone around her better just by believing they could be." Patricia nodded, her gaze still on the sunset. "Those people are rare. When we're lucky enough to have them in our lives, they leave a mark that never really fades." "No," Mason said softly, "and I'm starting to think they wouldn't want it to." The day of Dr. Whitfield's arrival dawned clear and cool, a perfect Montana autumn day with aspen trees turned golden against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. Mason spent the morning in the barn, addressing long-delayed maintenance with a focus that bordered on avoidance. It was Caroline who drove into Bozeman to pick up their guest from the conference center. When Mason finally returned to the house in the late afternoon, he found Dr. Whitfield seated in the living room, looking somehow both familiar and foreign. Without the constructed perception of advanced age and vision impairment, she appeared as she truly was, a woman in her early 60s with intelligent eyes and an air of professional composure. "Mason," she greeted him, standing as he entered, "thank you for allowing me to visit." "Dr. Whitfield," he acknowledged with a nod. "Welcome back to Eagle Ridge." "Please, call me Elaine," she requested. "I think we're well past professional formalities." Mason hesitated, then nodded again. "Elaine, then. Caroline's given you the tour?" "She has. The changes you've both made are remarkable. The organic certification, the greenhouse, the restored garden. It's clear that Eagle Ridge isn't just surviving, it's thriving." "We've been fortunate," Mason said diplomatically. Something like amusement flickered in her eyes. "Fortunately, yes, but also determined, innovative, and willing to do the hard work of rebuilding. Those qualities matter more than luck." Caroline appeared from the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. I've made Sarah's lamb stew recipe, if that's all right with everyone." The mention of Sarah's recipe was deliberate, Mason knew, a statement that his late wife's presence was acknowledged and honored in this house, not forgotten or replaced. He caught his sister's eye and nodded gratefully. Dinner was initially somewhat tense, but as the meal progressed, the conversation flowed more naturally. Dr. Whitfield, Elaine, spoke about her conference presentation, which had generated significant interest in her immersive narrative therapy approach. "Your case has been particularly valuable to the research," she told Mason. "The successful outcome provides compelling evidence for the efficacy of the technique in specific crisis situations." "Glad my psychological manipulation could advance science," Mason remarked dryly. Elaine accepted the barb without defensiveness. "Your skepticism is entirely warranted. The ethical considerations remain complex, which is why I've been advocating for strict protocols and oversight if the technique is to be used more broadly." "What would those protocols look like?" Caroline asked, genuinely curious. "Informed consent whenever possible, even if obtained from family members acting in the patient's best interest. Clear therapeutic goals established beforehand, regular assessment during the intervention, immediate termination if harm is detected, and perhaps most importantly, a comprehensive transition back to reality once the acute crisis has passed." Mason considered this. "So what happened to me would be considered, what, a prototype, a test case, more of an emergency intervention," Elaine clarified. "The technique was developed for veterans with severe PTSD who weren't responding to conventional treatments. Your situation presented similarities. Profound grief, complicated by isolation and financial crisis, creating an acute psychological emergency. And the elderly widow with failing eyesight narrative?" Mason pressed. "Was that standard or customized just for me?" "Each narrative is unique to the patient," Elaine explained. "It needs to address their specific psychological needs while providing a framework they can accept. In your case, the key elements were dignity, purpose, and connection, all things you'd lost after Sarah's death." The directness of her assessment was startling, but not inaccurate. Mason fell silent, processing her words as Caroline cleared the dinner plates. Later, as they sat on the porch with coffee, Elaine asked about the local therapist she had recommended. "Dr. Leland has been helpful," Mason admitted. "Conventional in his approach, but effective." "I'm glad to hear it," Elaine said. "Continued support is essential." "He doesn't know the full story," Mason added. "About your intervention." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "No, that's interesting. Why not tell him?" Mason looked out over the darkened ranch, considering the question. At first it was embarrassing. The idea that I could be so thorough, convinced of something that never happened. Later it just didn't seem relevant. We were addressing the underlying issues: grief, isolation, purpose. The catalyst that got me into therapy seemed less important than the work itself. Elaine nodded approvingly. That's a remarkably healthy perspective. Don't sound so surprised, Mason replied with a hint of humor. Your experimental therapy must have worked better than you expected. On the contrary, Elaine said seriously, I had high expectations for you from the beginning, Mason. Your sister's assessment of your character, strong, resilient, deeply caring despite your self-imposed isolation, proved entirely accurate. You were always capable of healing. You just needed a bridge to get you from the crisis back to solid ground. The next morning, Mason gave Elaine a proper tour of the ranch operations. The newly certified organic pastures, the modernized irrigation system, and the plans for expanded direct-to-consumer beef sales. Your sister mentioned you've been seeing Patricia Donovan, Elaine commented as they walked toward the barn. Mason shot her a suspicious glance. Caroline talks too much. She cares about you, Elaine countered, and she's invested in your happiness. Patricia and I are— Mason hesitated, searching for the right words, finding our way forward, carefully, respectfully. That sounds appropriate, Elaine observed. Healing doesn't mean rushing. They reached the old oak tree Mason had described to Elaine during their first drive to the ranch. The one he'd said was so wide it would take 3 people holding hands to encircle it. This tree is exactly as you described it, Elaine remarked, looking up at its massive branches, gnarled, majestic, reaching for the sky. Mason was struck by the memory. Him describing the tree to a woman he believed couldn't see it clearly, trying to convey its grandeur through words alone. It was strange to reconcile those memories with the reality of who Elaine actually was. Do you ever regret it? He asked suddenly. Using that technique on me. Creating a reality that wasn't real. Elaine considered the question seriously. I regret the necessity of it. In an ideal world, there would have been a less invasive way to help you through your crisis. But given the circumstances, your refusal of conventional help, the imminent loss of the ranch, your sister's legitimate fear for your life, no, I don't regret the intervention itself. She turned to face him directly. The narrative was constructed, Mason, but the progress you've made is entirely real. This ranch, your relationship with Caroline, your gradual re-engagement with the community, those aren't illusions or manipulations. They're the authentic results of your own strength and resilience once you found a way past the walls grief had built. Mason nodded slowly, accepting her assessment. I understand that now. It took time, but I did. As they walked back toward the house, Mason felt a sense of closure beginning to form, not just regarding Dr. Whitfield's intervention, but about the larger journey of grief and recovery he'd been traveling since Sarah's death. That evening, after Elaine had retired to the guest room, Mason sat with Caroline on the porch swing that had been Sarah's favorite spot. I think it was good that she came, Caroline said softly. For all of us. It was, Mason agreed, though I'm not sure I'll ever be entirely comfortable with her methods. Nor should you be, Caroline replied. But discomfort and gratitude can coexist. Life's complicated that way. Mason put his arm around his sister's shoulders, grateful, beyond words for her return to his life, however unconventionally it had come about. Patricia's invited us both to dinner on Saturday, he mentioned casually. I thought we might go, if you're free. Caroline smiled, but kept her gaze fixed on the starlit horizon. I'm free. And yes, I'd like that. As they sat in companionable silence, Mason reflected on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment, 6 months ago, he had been a man drowning in grief and debt, isolated and hopeless. Now, Eagle Ridge Ranch was solvent and innovating. His relationship with Caroline was restored and flourishing. The community he had withdrawn from had welcomed him back without judgment, and perhaps most surprisingly, his heart was cautiously opening to the possibility of new connections, new beginnings. None of it erased the past. Sarah's absence remained a daily reality, a space in his life that would always belong to her. But around that space, new growth had begun, like spring wildflowers emerging after a harsh Montana winter. Tomorrow, Elaine will return to Boston. The bizarre 3-day marriage that had never actually happened would recede further into memory, becoming a strange but pivotal chapter in the story of Mason Reed. What remained was the ranch, the legacy, and the future, uncertain as always, but no longer something to fear. "We should plant apple trees next spring," Caroline said, breaking the silence, "along the south fence line. Mom always wanted an orchard there." "Apple trees take years to mature," Mason pointed out. 5, maybe 7 years before they produce a decent crop. Caroline smiled, hearing the implicit question in his statement. "I'm not going anywhere, Mason. This is home now. For the long haul." Mason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Then we'll plant apple trees, and maybe extend the garden too. There's plenty of room for growth here." Together they watched as a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the Montana sky, brief, beautiful, and gone in an instant, but leaving the darkness a little less complete in its wake. 5 years had passed since the merger of Eagle Ridge and Willow Creek into what locals now simply called Reed Donovan Ranch. The sprawling operation had become something of a legend in Montana ranching circles. A case study in sustainable agriculture, family business resilience, and innovative land management that agricultural students from the state university frequently toured. On a crisp October morning, Mason stood on the porch of the home he and Patricia had built exactly where they had planned it, on the boundary line between the original properties, symbolically and practically uniting their operations. The timber and stone structure, with its wide windows and expansive views, had none of the ghosts that had haunted his old farmhouse, yet it incorporated carefully chosen elements from both their histories. The hand-carved banister from Eagle Ridge, the stained glass panels Patricia's husband had collected. "They're coming up the drive," Patricia called from inside, where she was putting final touches on what had become an annual tradition, the Reed Donovan Harvest Celebration. Mason spotted the familiar SUV winding its way along the tree-lined approach. Caroline was at the wheel, with her fiancé Michael beside her. In the back seat would be Dr. Elaine Whitfield, who had become an unexpected but welcome regular visitor to the ranch. The relationship with Dr. Whitfield had evolved over the years into something neither of them could have predicted during those bizarre 3 days of immersive therapy. Not friendship exactly. The foundation had been too ethically complex for that, but a mutual respect and ongoing connection that acknowledged their shared history while building something more balanced in its place. "How's the heritage wheat looking this year?" Patricia asked, joining him on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "Best yield yet," Mason replied, accepting the mug gratefully. "Caroline's idea to partner with that artisanal bakery in Bozeman is paying off. They've committed to taking the entire crop." Patricia smiled with satisfaction. At 63, she had lost none of her practical business sense or formidable energy. If anything, the merger of their ranches had invigorated her, providing new challenges and opportunities that kept her engaged and forward-looking. "The eco-cabins are fully booked through December," she noted. That European travel magazine feature really made a difference. The tourism venture that had begun with 5 modest cabins had expanded to 12 luxury accommodations, each offering a curated experience of ranch life, combined with unexpected comforts. Urban professionals and international travelers alike had embraced the concept of authentic Montana with actual plumbing, as Caroline jokingly marketed it. As Caroline's car pulled up, Mason felt the familiar warmth of family gathering. His sister, now 41, had finally found balance between her corporate career and ranch life, spending 1 week per month in Seattle and the rest at Eagle Ridge, where she and Michael had renovated the original farmhouse. Their wedding was scheduled for the spring, a celebration deliberately planned to coincide with the ranch's lambing season, a metaphor for new beginnings that Mason appreciated. "Uncle Mason!" a small voice called out as Caroline's car door opened. 8-year-old Emma Donovan, Patricia's granddaughter, burst from the vehicle and raced toward the porch, her younger brother Jake following more cautiously in her wake. Rachel and her husband David emerged next, waving as they supervised their children's excited reunion with their grandfather. Patricia's son, Mark, and his partner, Luis, were unpacking the trunk, arguing good-naturedly about the proper handling of the wine they'd brought. The last to emerge was Dr. Whitfield, now in her late 60s but still carrying herself with the same professional composure Mason remembered from their first genuine meeting. Her hair had turned completely silver, but her mind remained sharp as ever, her academic career having flourished alongside her controversial but increasingly accepted therapeutic approach. "Quite the gathering," Mason commented, as Patricia squeezed his hand before heading down to greet the children. Family gatherings had once been sources of dread for Mason, painful reminders of what he had lost. Now they were the cornerstone of a life rebuilt on stronger foundations, a blended family that honored their varied histories while creating something new and resilient. "Mason," Dr. Whitfield greeted him as she reached the porch. "The place looks magnificent. Your apple trees are finally bearing fruit. 3rd year of production," he confirmed. "We're pressing cider this afternoon if you're interested in observing or participating." "I wouldn't miss it," she replied with genuine enthusiasm. Their interaction was easier now, the initial tension having mellowed into a complicated but honest relationship. After the Reed-Donovan wedding 3 years earlier, where Dr. Whitfield had indeed been an invited guest, they had established a new pattern. She visited annually, sometimes to consult professionally on her ongoing research, sometimes simply as a witness to the life that had flourished from her unconventional intervention. "I brought you something," she said, reaching into her bag and extracting a book. "My latest publication. There's a chapter you might find particularly interesting." Mason accepted the volume. Narrative Reconstruction Therapy, Ethics, Applications and Outcomes, with a wry smile. "Let me guess which chapter." "Actually, you might be surprised," Dr. Whitfield replied. "It's not the case study of our work together, though that is included. It's the chapter on patient autonomy and consent. Your criticisms over the years have significantly shaped my thinking on the ethical frameworks necessary for this type of intervention." Mason raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "I'll read it with interest." Their conversation was interrupted by Rachel's approach. "Dr. Whitfield, would you mind if I picked your brain about Emma? She's been having some anxiety at school, and your perspective would be valuable." As Dr. Whitfield moved away with Rachel, Caroline bounded up the steps to embrace her brother. "Sorry we're late." Michael insisted on stopping to photograph every single golden aspen between Bozeman and here. "Wildlife photographer husband comes with certain occupational hazards," Mason teased, returning her hug. "Almost husband," Caroline corrected with a grin. "Still 6 months to go. Plenty of time for him to come to his senses." Mason laughed, knowing how unlikely that was. Michael had integrated into their unconventional family seamlessly, his quiet nature and artist's eye bringing a different perspective. To the practical, business-oriented clan, "How are the wedding plans coming?" Mason asked, as they moved inside to help Patricia with final preparations. Caroline rolled her eyes dramatically. "You'd think planning a wedding would be simple compared to restructuring a multi-million-dollar ranch operation, but apparently not. Patricia has been a lifesaver, keeping us on track when we get bogged down in details. The kitchen was a hub of controlled chaos, with Patricia directing traffic as various family members unpacked additional food contributions. The long harvest table that served as the heart of their communal gatherings was already set for 14. The Reed-Donovan extended family had grown considerably over the years. "Mason, can you check on the fire pit?" Patricia requested. "Mark and Louise brought oysters they want to roast later." The autumn tradition had evolved organically, a weekend of harvest activities culminating in an elaborate meal that celebrated both the season's bounty and the growing connections between once separate families. Apple pressing, pumpkin carving for the children, horseback riding across the expanded property, and always stories shared around the fire as night fell. As Mason stepped back outside to prepare the fire pit, he passed the framed photographs that lined the entrance hall, a visual timeline of their blended history. Sarah and his parents in the early days of Eagle Ridge, Patricia and her late husband breaking ground on Willow Creek Ranch, Caroline as a child on their father's shoulders, Rachel and Mark at various ages, his and Patricia's wedding 3 years ago, the most recent addition, Emma and Jake on horseback, the future generation of Reed-Donovans beginning their connection to the land. The fire pit, set in a sheltered courtyard between the house and the original barn, was Mason's favorite gathering spot. Stone benches arranged in a semicircle provided comfortable seating, while the pit itself, constructed of river rocks from the creek that now flowed uninterrupted through their combined property, cast both warmth and dancing light. When, lit, as he knelt to arrange the kindling, Mason heard soft footsteps approaching. "Need any help?" It was Michael, Caroline's fiancé, camera still hanging around his neck. "Always," Mason replied, gesturing to the stack of split oak beside the pit. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, arranging the wood for an optimal burning pattern. Michael had proven to be an unexpected ally in Mason's life, his quiet, observant nature providing a counterbalance to the more forceful personalities that dominated both Reed and Donovan families. "Caroline seems happy," Michael commented, adjusting a log carefully. "Happier every time we come here." "The ranch has that effect," Mason agreed. "It grounds her, I think. Reminds her where she came from, even while she's figuring out where she's going." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "She talks about your parents sometimes. And Sarah, I wish she could have known them better. They would have liked you," Mason said sincerely. "My father appreciated people who observe before they speak. My mother would have loved your photographs. And Sarah," he paused, finding the words, "Sarah would have appreciated how you support Caroline's dual life without making her choose between worlds." It was still sometimes surprising how easily he could speak of Sarah now, with fondness rather than crushing grief, with appreciation for what had been rather than bitter regret for what was lost. The therapy with Dr. Leland, continued intermittently over the years, had helped. So had Patricia's matter-of-fact acceptance of Sarah's continued presence in his heart. "I have something to run by you," Michael said hesitantly. "A wedding gift. Idea for Caroline. I wanted your opinion before I commit." He pulled out his phone and showed Mason a series of photographs, golden light filtering through trees, the distinctive silhouette of Eagle Ridge's hills, close-ups of heritage wheat stalks bending in the breeze. "I've been documenting the ranch through the seasons," Michael explained. "I thought I'd create a book, not just photographs, but stories too. Family history, ranch evolution, plans for the future. I've been secretly interviewing everyone when Caroline isn't around." Mason studied the images, impressed by how they captured not just the physical beauty of the land, but something more elusive, its spirit, its continuity across generations. "She'll treasure this," he said firmly. "It's perfect." Michael looked relieved. "There's one more thing. I'd like to include some material about Sarah, her contributions to the ranch, her vision for it, but only if you're comfortable with that." The request touched Mason deeply, more than comfortable. "I think it's important. This place carries her influence, even now. The heritage wheat was her project originally, the garden design. Even some of the sustainability practices Caroline's implemented had roots in what Sarah was researching before she got sick. Family legacies aren't just about blood relations," Michael observed. "They're about continuing good work, whoever started it." Mason clapped him on the shoulder, appreciating the wisdom in the younger man's perspective. "Exactly right." As the day progressed, the ranch came alive with activity. Emma and Jake insisted on riding lessons from their Grandpa Mason, a title that had materialized organically a couple of years back and still warmed him every time he heard it. Patricia and Rachel coordinated the elaborate meal preparation, while Mark, Luis, and David set up the cider press operation. Dr. Whitfield seamlessly integrated into the proceedings, her annual visits having established her as a familiar, if unusual, presence. Mason observed her deep in conversation with Caroline about the latest developments in her research, then later helping Emma overcome her nervousness around the smaller pony Patricia had acquired specifically for the grandchildren's visits. By late afternoon, the courtyard was filled with the sweet scent of pressed apples, as gallons of fresh cider were produced from the ranch's first substantial harvest. Mason took a moment to step back and observe the scene. 3 generations, moving in easy harmony, the separate strands of their lives now woven into a single tapestry. "Penny for your thoughts," Patricia said, appearing at his side with 2 glasses of cider, an echo of a conversation they'd had years earlier at that first merger celebration. Mason accepted the glass, breathing in the crisp apple aroma. "Just appreciating the view." Patricia followed his gaze across the courtyard. "We've built something good here," she said simply. Her pragmatic understatement made Mason smile. "Yes, we have." As twilight approached, they gathered around the fire pit, the blended family finding their places on the stone benches. Mason lit the fire with practiced efficiency, the flames catching quickly among the carefully arranged logs. The tradition called for each person to share something they were grateful for from the past year and something they looked forward to in the coming one. Emma went first, her 8-year-old enthusiasm infectious as she expressed gratitude for her new pony and excitement about being a flower girl at Aunt Caroline's wedding. Jake followed, his shyer nature making his contribution briefer but no less heartfelt. Around the circle they went, each voice adding to the collective narrative of their intertwined lives. Dreams achieved and challenges overcome, small victories and meaningful setbacks. Throughout it all, Mason noticed the deliberate acknowledgement of those not physically present. Patricia's late husband, Mark, and Rachel's father, whose values and visions still influenced their choices. Mason's parents, whose legacy lived on in the very soil beneath their feet. And Sarah, whose initial dreams for Eagle Ridge had blossomed in ways she could never have imagined. When Dr. Whitfield's turn came, she spoke with unexpected emotion. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to witness genuine healing, not just in the clinical sense, but in the fullest meaning of the word. To see a family and a place restored to wholeness, more vibrant than before, because of, not despite, the challenges overcome." Her gaze met Mason's across the fire, conveying something beyond words, acknowledgement of their complicated beginning, appreciation for the journey since, and perhaps a touch of professional pride in the outcome of her most unorthodox case. When Mason's turn arrived, he found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the simple abundance of things he could name. The successful organic certification renewed for another 5 years. The Heritage Wheat Program now supplies specialty bakeries across 3 states, the eco-tourism venture that had exceeded even Caroline's optimistic projections, his marriage to Patricia, a partnership that strengthened with each passing season. But what emerged when he spoke surprised even him. "I'm grateful for the crisis," he said, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the attentive faces surrounding him, "not for its pain or fear, but for its clarity. 7 years ago, I stood at the edge of losing everything. This land, my purpose, perhaps even my life. That precipice, terrifying as it was, ultimately revealed what truly mattered." He glanced at Dr. Whitfield, acknowledging her role without resentment. "Through unconventional means, I found my way back, not to what was, but to what could be. I discovered that legacy isn't about preserving things exactly as they were. It's about carrying forward what's valuable while creating space for new growth." Patricia's hand found his, a gesture of support and shared understanding. "As for the coming year," Mason continued, "I look forward to watching new connections form. Caroline and Michael's wedding, the university partnership program Caroline's establishing, the heritage seed bank we're developing with the Conservation Trust." He smiled at Emma and Jake. "And of course more riding lessons with these two, who'll be running this place someday, if I'm not mistaken." The circle completed with Michael, whose gratitude focused on finding family in unexpected places and whose hopes centered on capturing the ranch's beauty through all 4 seasons for his book project, still spoken of hypothetically for Caroline's benefit. As night fell completely, the conversation flowed naturally from the formal sharing to casual discussion. Mason found himself beside Dr. Whitfield on one of the stone benches, slightly removed from the main group. "You've created something remarkable here," she observed quietly. "Something that extends far beyond what I could have anticipated when Caroline first contacted me." "We created it," Mason corrected. "All of us, in different ways, even you, despite our complicated beginning." Dr. Whitfield nodded, accepting this. "In my new book, I've proposed strict ethical guidelines for narrative intervention therapy, patient autonomy, informed consent from family members, clear exit strategies, comprehensive follow-up support. All lessons learned, in part, from our experience." "Good," Mason said simply. "Others deserve the potential benefits without the ethical ambiguity." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the firelight illuminate the faces of the gathered family. "You know," Dr. Whitfield said finally, "in all my years of practice, I've never seen a more complete restoration than what you've achieved here. Not just personal healing, but the creation of something new that honors what came before while embracing what might be." "That's the thing about rock bottom," Mason replied, echoing words Patricia had spoken years earlier. "The only way out is up. Some people just need a more dramatic boost to start the climb." Dr. Whitfield smiled, recognizing her own therapeutic principles reflected back to her. Indeed. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, children to bed, dishes to be cleared, plans made for the next day's activities, Mason found himself alone briefly on the porch, looking out over the ranch. Lights glowed in the eco-cabins along the creek, where guests were experiencing their own version of Montana hospitality. The combined herds of Reed Donovan cattle rested peacefully in the certified organic pastures. The heritage wheat fields, recently harvested, lay fallow under the moonlight, regenerating for next year's planting, and everywhere evidence of renewed purpose and connection. Not just survival, but flourishing. Patricia joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Everyone's settled. Caroline and Michael are taking Dr. Whitfield on a moonlight tour of the new native plant restoration project by the creek." Mason nodded. Unsurprised, his sister never missed an opportunity to showcase their latest sustainability initiative. "I was thinking," Patricia said, "about what you said earlier, about the crisis revealing what truly matters. Something you understand too." Mason acknowledged, thinking of her own journey after her husband's death. Yes, she agreed, though I took a more conventional path through it. Her tone was teasing, referencing the unusual circumstances of his therapeutic intervention. Mason chuckled. Nothing about the Reed Donovan story is entirely conventional. And thank goodness for that, Patricia replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching. The moonlight silver the expansive landscape before them. The ranch stretched out, a living testament to resilience, adaptation and growth, not just of the land and livestock, but of the people who stewarded it. 7 years earlier, Mason had agreed to what he believed was a marriage to an elderly widow with failing eyesight, a desperate attempt to save his family legacy. 3 days later, he had discovered her secret, a revelation that had initially seemed like betrayal but ultimately opened the door to genuine healing. Now, standing with Patricia on the porch of their shared home, surrounded by the blended family they had built together, Mason reflected on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment. The false narrative had created space for a true story to emerge, one richer, more complex, and ultimately more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined during those dark days. The ranch would continue, evolving with each generation while maintaining its essential character. The legacy lived on, not as a burden, but as a gift, passed forward with both reverence for the past and vision for the future. "Come on," Patricia said, tugging gently at his arm. "Let's walk down and see what Caroline's showing off now. I hear..." "The native grasses are spectacular in the moonlight," Mason smiled, turning away from the view to face his wife. "Lead the way." Together, they descended the porch steps and set off across the land they both loved, moving confidently into the future. They had built from the ashes of separate pasts. Behind them, the lights of their home glowed warmly in the Montana night, a beacon of welcome for all who belonged there, by blood, by choice, or by the complicated, beautiful circumstances that had brought them together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.